The story begins with a young man from the countryside wanting to migrate to the imperial capital in search of success and fame. He already finds it incredible when he finally arrives in the imperial capital and already thinks if he makes good money he can buy a dream village. Arriving in a guild, our young protagonist receives a form from a man. The gentleman completely dismisses the protagonist, who asks why he can't be tested, and the man goes on to say that there has been a recession and that candidates are limited. But then he even wonders if they can arrest him, and then suddenly a young blonde woman appears who tells the protagonist if he wants some kind of help because he might be in trouble. He is stunned by what he sees in front of him. She asks what he has, but he apparently got very excited about it, and so the blonde starts questioning the protagonist if it was his dreams of leaving the countryside that made him go to the capital he finds himself in now. After hearing this, he already stands up surprised, asking how she knew this. So she says that it was through her eyes, and after living so long in the capital she already realizes who is from the outside, and already says that she knows a scheme for him to get a job in the government or everything that the protagonist wants, and she says that she will tell him all the details, but she will only tell him if he takes her to eat. And so the atmosphere of the anime changes and they are in a restaurant. And so the atmosphere of the anime changes and they are in a bar. She drinks non-stop. Meanwhile, the protagonist just wants to know what is the scheme that he has to do to work soon for the government, and she says that the young Tatsumi needs to have contacts and money. That is, the protagonist needs a contact in the army and money to get into it. So he takes the money from his purse and asks the girl to tell him about it from his purse, and asks the blonde if this is enough, and she says yes. And then the protagonist begins to tell how he got all this money that was through rewards killing various types of beasts. Noticing that he defeated several monsters, she calls him strong and is even impressed and says that he will become an officer overnight. Then she takes him and says overnight. Then she takes and leaves with the money of the protagonist of the bar, until the protagonist waits for several hours and realizes that she will not return. He says that he was going to report her for cheating him. He was really angry with the whole situation, and then the man who was as a waiter at the bar says that there is no point in denouncing her because in this period of recession they have a lot of money. After leaving the bar on the street, the protagonist remembers the woman's breasts and how surprised he was afterwards. He reflects on how in the countryside this would never happen, but who could blame him for believing in a complete stranger and being deceived by the beauty that the blonde girl had. So he decides to take a nap on the street and sleep until suddenly a carriage appears with a young blonde girl who also seemed more like a child, who calls him to sleep in her house. And now, totally suspicious of everything, he already says he has no money, but the girl says she only wants to help and doesn't need money, and so the protagonist simply accepts. And when he arrives at her house he feels very grateful and realizes how her guards are quite strong. He even gets excited knowing how good it is to see that there are kind people like that even in the imperial capital, and begins to tell of his past. The young Tatsumi went to the capital along with 3 friends from the countryside. They trained intensely in childhood and were great friends, and while walking to the capital something strange occurred. Unknown people arrived and they were robbed and had to be, but as they are strong the protagonist did not even worry so much about his friends because he knows they would arrive well. Continuing the conversation at the house of the girl, Lord in front of Tatsumi speaks that will pass your contact with his acquaintance from the army, everything that the protagonist wanted, and he is extremely grateful. The next day a coast guard speaks with Tatsumi and shows that there in the background of the landscape is where is the palace in the center of the imperial capital, and the protagonist asks if that is where the great emperor lives. And he says no, because in fact the emperor is just a child and the prime minister is who controls the emperor behind the scenes, or he is the reason the country is in ruins, completely manipulating the emperor behind his back. After almost Tatsumi speak ill of the prime minister, the coast guard asks him not to say anything suspicious, because if they hear they are screwed with all this crisis in the empire. The guard still points to the posts of criminals called night raid, a group of mercenaries that terrorizes the imperial capital, who attack their victims only at night. They are usually members of the high or rich of the capital. Suddenly the anime Akame ga Kill shows a character who has just annihilated a young girl in front of him, and the protagonist already wakes up smelling blood, and when he looks out the window is the night raid, the exact group he had talked to the coast guard earlier. He even wonders if the A character with black hair and a man full of armor suddenly gives the young woman with black hair a name called Akami, and she easily kills them all along with the guy full of armor. With all this confusion the protagonist runs a lot and ends up finding the girl who helped him to stay at her house. Tatsumi in front of the girl who helped him asks Akami to stop the attack, but she ignores him completely while an extra appears and shoots at Akami. Obviously she does it all easily and eliminates him completely. Then Akami runs to eliminate the blonde girl and tells Tatsumi that he is not the target and he does not need to die in vain. Even so, the protagonist feels obligated to return the favor to the girl, and intends to risk his life to save her. During the duel between Akami and Tatsumi, the protagonist knows that he cannot defeat Akami, but he still acts without thinking and ends up being hit and falls to the ground. The blonde from the bar who deceived Tatsumi with her beauty and blackmail arrives at the right moment and tells him that she owed a favor to Tatsumi and now she would finally pay the favor to him. And to Tatsumi's surprise, the blonde shows him the darkness of the imperial capital, telling him that they attract country people with sweet words and then torture and play with them until they die inside this house. And so after opening the basement of the house, the protagonist sees the face of his friend from the countryside all finished, and then he sees the face of his friend all tortured in pain. Then his friend all bruised talks about how they stopped there. Unfortunately they ate the food that the protagonist's kind girl delivered and lost consciousness. It was at that moment when they realized they had stopped there, and so the protagonist gets his eyes wide open. He cries and realizes that this all tortured girl, being his former friend, is already gone. Meanwhile, the supposedly blonde, gentle girl who brought Armadilazmi to this house, she starts screaming and going crazy, talking about how they are all a bunch of worthless rednecks and a herd of. Finally Tatsumi realizes what a family of sadistic power freaks they are and treat people like dirt. The blonde girl is still jealous of the straight hair that Tatsumi's former friend had, and so she tortures her and makes her torture her. His friend, all wounded, thanks his friend Tatsumi and feels relieved to have taken revenge, but unfortunately to Tatsumi's surprise again his friend is very ill and about to die because the victims of the house were also drugged, and so his friend dies in front of him. He enters the night raid even though against his own will. Then the first episode of Akame ga Kill ends.